morning, everybody, and welcome to this SANEA session together with McKinsey on the 1.5 degree challenge. SANEA is very excited to be hosting this session today. We have recently completed our climate change statement, and although SANEA is non-partisan and we don't support or not support any particular technology, we certainly support the drive towards making sure that we don't go over 2 degrees and the Paris commitments that South Africa and other countries have signed up to. So that's why we think today's discussion is going to be really important, and we're very fortunate to have a wonderful McKinsey team with us who are going to take us through some of the really amazing analytical work that they have done around some of the practicalities of getting to that or staying within a 1.5 degree temperature increase. So I'm going to hand over to Canon Lakmiaran, who is a partner at McKinsey and who has had a very long association with SANEA, and let him introduce the team and start the session. So SANEA, Canon, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and great to be here. And thank you again to SANEA for allowing us to share our perspectives on what we think is the biggest challenge out there right now. One of my colleagues, while the music was playing, was saying it feels like we've been cheered on, and I think that from the intro music. But in all seriousness, this is probably the biggest challenge facing humanity at the moment, and it requires a global solution. So we're happy to be able to share our perspectives and hopefully contribute to the debate in the country. Just to let you know who's in the room from McKinsey, now I'll just do introductions on their behalf and then set up the discussion. We have Francia van der Marel and Bram Smith, who are going to take us through the initial session of the presentation around our global work on meeting the 1.5 degree kind of challenge. How do we keep temperatures to below 1.5 degree above the baseline? Francia is a partner based out of Amsterdam, does a lot of energy transitions work in Europe, but also in Africa, and she's got a close association with South Africa. She spent quite a few years here working with government, public sector, and private sector clients on energy issues. Bram is an associate partner, also based right now out of Amsterdam. He's a co-leader in our energy insights team, which does a lot of analytics works globally, and very passionate about this topic and has been involved in probably in some way in every report we've published on this topic in recent years. Hauke Engel, who's a partner, we say Nairobi, but he's actually based in Dar es Salaam, just moved there recently in Tanzania, but based in East Africa office, was based in Europe, and has also done a lot of energy transition, climate risk, looking at also the physical impact, right? The actual impact on populations, on nature, and on industry across the world, and in more recent times has done a lot of work in Africa as well. I co-lead our electric power and natural gas practice in Africa, as well as our public and social sector practice, and I'm very passionate about our transition in South Africa. And I'll come to Hauke will kind of do the second chapter, and I'll do the third. Just to set this up, we believe that climate risks are, the climate change risks are probably the kind of number one issue that's on top of mind of CEOs and policymakers. I know we've had different kind of views on whether this is even a real thing. I think our clear view is that this is, like I said, the most important issue to deal with globally. And as McKinsey, we've made it one of our top priorities. We've seen how it impacts physical risk, but and based on that, how it has impacted the way we think of corporate commitments to net zero. How do we think about the technology needed to deal with this? How do we get consumers to be an active part of this change? And that impacts the way regulators think about this, and also how the financial sector starts to think about financing this change. What I'd like to do now is just take you through how we'd like to structure this this session. We're going to start with the global, our view on the global net zero pathway. Bram and Francia will take us through that. What are the climate risk impact for Africa? Hauke will do that. And then I'll end off with the South Africa energy perspective. We'll then have some time for a question and answer session after about an hour of presentation. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Bram.
I will actually start taking the word. Good morning, everyone. And in case you struggle with my name, which is rather complicated, it's France, like the country, and Che, like Che Guevara, Francia. Very pleased to be here. This topic, as Kanan has been saying, is largely recognized by many governments. And what we see on this first slide is that already 73% of energy-related CO2 emissions are covered under net zero targets. So there is a host of countries, which you see on the bottom, that have already said, we commit to net zero by 2050. Yet, this is only 73%, and there still is this outstanding 27% of countries and emissions that haven't done the commitment yet. On top of that, the 73%, the big challenge is now how to translate this into concrete and hard actions and regulations. And if we go to the next slide, that is very important, because if we continue as we are doing right now, we're on that top red line. And the expectation is, if we continue our emissions like we have been growing today, that we get to a situation where there can be up to 5 degrees of temperature rise across the world. It doesn't look that dire. There are already a lot of policies in place in the countries that you saw on the previous page. And if you look at that orange line, that is the pathway that we are on if all the current policies are actually being implemented. The expectations are that we get to, what would I say, like 3.5 degrees temperature rise by 2100. You also see the green and the blue line. And I think this picture is actually pretty stark, because it feels that we're talking a lot about climate change, that policies are being made. But if you want to get to this 1.5 degree pathway, you see the gap between that orange line and the blue line, and a lot is still needed. And if we go then to the next page, why do we actually worry about sort of the temperature rise? This is a bit of illustration around the feedbacks that the world and nature is giving us due to these temperature rises. And on the left-hand side, you see a lot of things that could happen, sort of the loss of the Arctic summer sea, alpine glaciers in Europe, the Greenland glacier collapse, et cetera, et cetera. And what you already start seeing there is that when temperatures are rising, the feedback mechanism starts playing out. And today, what you have been seeing already in the news is the expectation is that we are already today at this 1.5 or 1.1, I should say, 1.1, 1.2 degree pathway already today. If we then go to the next page, Bram, maybe you want to talk here about sort of how we actually now continue and how the moment is coming actually now to start decreasing carbon emissions.
Absolutely, thank you, Francia, and good morning, everyone. If we go a couple of years back in time, and we start roughly in 2000, as we see on this page, we've been having this decarbonization debate for a long time already, of course. And back in 2000, if we would have a look at the trajectory that would be required in order to get to global warming that's limited to 1.5 degrees, we actually see that from the roughly 27, 28 gigatons of emissions that we had at a day, you can see a rather gradual line that slopes down, and that would get us to a target of by 2100 of 1.5 degrees. Now, of course, what has happened in the world since then is massive economic development, China ramping up and industrializing incredibly, India increasingly ramping up, Africa, large parts following suit. And what we see is that emissions therefore have continued to increase to well above 40 gigatons today. And if we then look at the implication that has for the pathway in order to get to 1.5 degrees, and that's what you see in different variations on this page, is that clearly the steepness of that line has increased year by year by year. And where we've gotten to now is a point which is the white bold line that you see on this page, that requires indeed a very steep decline going forward. We'll talk in a moment about specifically what it takes to get to roughly net zero emissions by 2050 already, which is what it takes to control warming to 1.5 degrees. But why this is particularly important is because there's a stark debate going on that distinguishes between an orderly transition versus a disorderly transition. And an orderly transition you can think of as a still somewhat gradual, controlled transition to a strong decarbonization. A disorderly transition would be a path where, through large-scale disasters, through large-scale migration, the world in a way comes to a halt, and country by country starts to be in a way forced to move into decarbonization measures, which of course is a much less orderly and therefore less predictable pathway. Now, with that context, if we go to the next page, we started an effort roughly 2.5 years ago, where we looked at a large body of mostly academic literature that helps us understand in greater detail what does it now take to reduce emissions in line with the 1.5 degree pathway. And whereas there's hundreds of models and publications out there that talk about this topic, what we tried to do then was translate that mostly academic body of work into implications and takeaways for business leaders, policymakers. And what we found is that there's 4 common denominators in a lot of those works. First of all, in order to reduce our emissions and move to a 1.5 degree pathway, we need to move very quickly in the short run. So by 2030, we need to see at a global level already a reduction of 50 to 55% in CO2 emissions. Second, we've got a total carbon budget of 570 gigatons of CO2 until 2050. Now, this starts counting in 2018. And if we do the math, that gives us roughly 15 years worth of today's carbon emissions. And indeed, when we looked at the IPCC report that was published just a few weeks ago, we see that the world, despite the COVID pandemic and the reduction in emissions, has continued to eat away of that carbon budget. And therefore, we're now at, the range that's being estimated is between 400 and 550, but so we're somewhere close to 500 gigatons in terms of budget. Then the third requirement is on the right-hand side of this page. It is by 2050, we need to be at net zero globally. And what that means is we need to be almost at zero in terms of the gross emissions that we have. There can be some emissions left from very hard to abate industries. Think about some of the transport segments in aviation, marine. Think about some of the heavy industries, cement production, arms production. But any ton of emissions that's still left needs to be compensated as well by negative emissions. This can be through forestation and trees. It can also be through technological solutions that we'll talk about in a moment. Finally, fourth common denominator, we need to strongly reduce other greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane and nitrous oxides, that in fact have much stronger impacts also on global warming, and therefore need attention. We'll talk about it in a moment as well. Now, with that framing up front, what we then started to look at is how can we now get there? So what in a way is the action plan of starting to move to a 1.5 degree pathway? And We did it at a global level. We also, by now, have done it for over 40 individual countries to establish decarbonization pathways. We'll talk about some examples later today. And in total cover roughly 70% of global emissions with that work. And if we bring all of that together, what we see is an action plan with 10 prerequisites, requirements in total that we can split over 4 categories. And we found this actually helpful to help structure the debate a little bit. If we start in the left top corner, we need to reduce demand. And that's through efficiency gains, that's through moving to a circular economy. It's partially also by shifting consumption patterns. Think about meat consumption, but also think about enormous waste that we have incorporated in today's economies. In total, this can reduce roughly 15% of emissions already by changing the demand picture. Then the second category is all about the way we power and fuel our lives. And that starts with mass scale electrification. In a way, electrification is a relatively accessible decarbonization measure because we know how to produce zero carbon power. It's not easy, but we know technologically what it takes. So that means in transport, in buildings, in industrial processes, electrify at scale what's possible. To give you an idea, today, roughly 20% of the energy consumption mix is electricity. In a 1.5 degree pathway that we need to grow to between 50 and 60% of the total mix. Then the way that we produce that power needs to move rapidly to renewables. That's a topic that has received a lot of attention, but also number 4, we need to expand the role of hydrogen and bioenergy in that system. And often those go hand in hand, of course, when we use green power sources to produce hydrogen. Then at the bottom, we need to also scale up our carbon management, which is a matter of technological measures, so scaling carbon capture and storage. It's also a matter of natural measures, so halting deforestation, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We spoke earlier about how trees actually have an important role to play there, alongside direct air capture and other technological methods. Now, finally, I spoke briefly about other greenhouse gases. So on the right bottom of this page, tackle methane and nitrous oxide. And that is largely related to agriculture and food systems. Especially cows and sheep through enteric fermentation are a very important source of methane emissions, but also rice production in our current approach. Rice production is a very important contributor. We can shift to new ways of new production methods. We need to probably shift the global diet in a way together as well. And then finally, eliminate fugitive methane emissions, which is a topic that especially is related to production of natural gas, oil, coal, and it's receiving a lot of attention for many of the energy companies today as one of the key decarbonization measures.
Bram, I'd like to add something to this point, to those 10 things. This shows us very well why it is so difficult and why we actually struggle, not only in South Africa, but everywhere in the world with this problem. Because these 10 things touch everyone, touch every sector, and need sort of a complete integrated policy and a complete integrated change of humanity. We all struggled with COVID. And the changes there, and that was, we just experienced how something globally touches life and how difficult that is. The magnitude of these changes are also very, very all-encompassing and very challenging, and not only for governments, but also for us as individuals. And I want to stipulate that point and actually the struggle that countries have to get it right.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. And that's a great point. And to illustrate that, in 2020, during the COVID pandemic, global greenhouse gas emissions, or CO2 emissions, were roughly 7% below what they were the year before. Now, in order to get to a 1.5 degree pathway, what we will need to see the next 30 years is every year a 7% decline in order to get to the target. And clearly, during the COVID pandemic, we saw a decline for exactly the wrong reasons, because global economy largely came to a halt. But so that's indeed the magnitude of the challenge that's ahead of us.
And Bram, this is an example from the Netherlands. I'm currently based in Amsterdam, and it's true that last year we had a 7% decline. This morning, the Dutch government published the CO2 emissions for the last quarter in the Netherlands, and we're back on the pre-pandemic level. So already, we're not sort of at the -7%, but we're already back at the level that we were before.
It's of course important to stress that we can use different measures than locking down the entire economy to achieve emissions reductions. We're not trying to suggest that the COVID measures are the best way to reduce emissions.
Thank you, Hauke.
Now, yes, it's important to emphasize that, right? So during the COVID lockdown, we saw a reduction for exactly the wrong reasons. What we try to sketch here is a perspective on what a pathway could look like in a more orderly transition also. Now, let me talk very briefly about some examples about the short-term requirements. So back to Frank's point, we've established a pathway that we think is technologically feasible. It requires significant additional R&D, but it does not require kind of magical solutions like nuclear fusion at massive scale suddenly being available. But what it does require is, especially in the very short run, so the next 10 years, a very, very rapid acceleration in this whole transition. And without wanting to go into all of the details that we see on the page, to give you some sense, number two, the number of electric vehicle cars on the road. We're today roughly at 15 million in what we call our reference case scenario, which you can think of as a economic optimization case without looking or assuming additional policies. We see a stark uptick in electric vehicles simply because their economics are improving, more and more models are getting available. 270 million cars by 2030. Now, for a 1.5 degree pathway, we need to see a further increase to 250 million cars globally already by 2030. If we look at the renewables deployed, we would need to see a tenfold increase over the course of the next 8 years of renewables installed. Same for hydrogen. So we see in our reference case an increase from roughly 8 exajoule today to 14 exajoule. That's largely coming from green hydrogen. For a 1.5 degree pathway, that needs to increase further to 21 exajoules, which means more than a doubling of the green hydrogen contribution. The synthesis of all of that is we see a feasible pathway, but this is a very challenging task and challenge ahead, and it requires also action and an acceleration in the transition across sectors and across the global economy. Now, if we go to the next page, to then have a look at what are the implications now, what would be the impacts on the global energy system of such a shift. Let's divide it into a left-hand side where we look at fossil fuels and the right-hand side where we look at renewables. Clearly, if such a pathway were to materialize, that would significantly reduce demand for oil by over 75%. Similarly, gas, 73%, coal as the strongest or the most polluting fossil fuel, we need to see over 90% of reduction. And at the same time, on the right-hand side, we would need to see a massive ramp up of solar capacity onshore and offshore wind. Now, let me once again emphasize, this is not McKinsey saying that this is the most likely pathway to realize. This is us having a look at what would it take? What would you have to believe in order to move to a 1.5 degree pathway? And the key takeaway is we think that it's technologically feasible. It will be economically, socio-economically, politically very challenging. And at the same time, will also offer massive new opportunities in terms of renewables markets that are being created, hydrogen markets that are being created, CCUS, which is going to see a significant ramp up. Maybe with that, let me wrap up this global picture as a way of a prelude and introduction, and hand over to Hauke, who can talk more about the implications for Africa.
Over to you.
Super, thank you. So what we wanted to do in this next section is just very briefly dive into some of the risks rather than the opportunities that this creates, right? And that this should not come across as a one-sided perspective. So there are definitely opportunities the continent, for companies on the continent. We thought it was fair to also shed some light on the challenges that this would create. So what we wanted to look at was first the impacts of the changing climate, the physical climate risks. So what would happen if we do not take swift action, and indeed what to some degree would also happen if we do take swift action. So what we call the adaptation imperative does not go away even if we take decisive action on decarbonization. The climate has already changed. It will continue to change because some warming is already baked in for the future, even if we reduce emissions tomorrow to zero, right? So we do need to figure out what the changing climate means for countries, for citizens, for companies, and increase our adaptation and resilience. So this is kind of the twin imperative for the next decade. It's the adaptation resilience and the decarbonization challenge that we need to navigate. So to start off with, just a few pages, a few maps where we show some results from climate science. So this of course is not McKinsey work. We drew on the best available science here just to, and again, it's not exhaustive, but just some examples to show how the changing climate could affect citizens and companies in Africa. So the first slide here, what we look at is water availability. And what we looked at here is kind of on the ground water availability, because we thought that's the most directly relevant. And how that would change compared to today on a 2030 and 2050 timeframe under a scenario of continued high emissions. So you always have to ask when you see these kind of maps, what's the emission scenario that's being looked at? This is the one called RCP 8.5, which is the scenario of continued high emissions, which we hopefully will not follow. But it is also instructive insofar as under this scenario, this emissions trajectory, the 2030 numbers correspond to roughly 1.5 degrees of warming. So what we show here as 2030 is actually what we would get to even in the best case scenario on decarbonization. And the 2050 number is corresponding to roughly 2 degrees of warming. So if we manage to stabilize the climate at 2 degrees of warming, no matter at what point in time, what we here call 2050 is where we would end up with. So this is kind of the changes that we would see under these warming scenarios. Now we've here put it as annuals, just to make it more tangible in terms of where we would end up if we don't act. And as you can see here, groundwater availability is particularly severely changed, the negative in the Maghreb, Northwest Africa, and in Southern Africa. And of course, we're already seeing some of those effects, but what we're seeing today is going to change much more going forward if we don't take these dramatic actions. On the next page, we also wanted to look at some other climate variables. Here's the precipitation. So what we see happening to rainfall patterns is that they typically get a lot more extreme. So we have more compressed precipitation, that it just rains a lot more in a short amount of time, and then prolonged droughts in between. So even though the total rainfall volume on an annual basis may not change much, when it falls and to what volumes per hour, so to say, fall does change quite a bit in many instances. So we see more extremes of precipitation. As you can see, particularly in Central Africa, we'll see much more extreme rainfall events, which then of course can lead to all sorts of flooding, etc., knock-on impacts that then quite severely can impact agriculture, infrastructure, cities, etc. So that's the water side. The other important metric is always temperature. In particular, the combination of temperature and humidity, because that's really what impacts humans. Because when the air is very dry, we can sweat, dissipate heat, and manage kind of our body heat to some extent. If it's very hot and very humid, of course, as we all know, that's a lot harder. Then human performance is impacted. Our bodies just don't perform as well when it's very hot and very humid. So labor productivity for jobs that need to be done outside, like in construction, in agriculture, and open pit mining, are then negatively impacted. At some point, we also get into quite serious mortality territory. This we did not show here. This is showing the impact of increased humidity and heat on labor productivity, which, as you can see, is already today present in parts of the Sahel, for example. But that's going to change significantly and spread regionally. That we see more reduced working hours, more reduced labor productivity in a scenario of continued high emissions. What we did not show here is indeed then at some point we would also see the risks of heat waves that are so severe, where the temperatures and humidity exceed levels which is actually unsafe to be outside. And these will be, the probability of those happening will be non-zero in the next couple of decades. on a scenario of continued high emissions. So there's also a more direct mortality risk on top of the labor productivity impacts. And then of course we can translate this into GDP impacts, et cetera, but we just wanted to kind of show the direct hazards, so to say, the physical changes. This is a quite interesting analysis we did recently with the COP26 organizing team, where we tried to translate then these physical changes to who is actually impacted, the exposed population. So we looked at population density maps, overlaid this with these hazard maps that we looked at before, and asked, okay, how many people are actually going to feel those impacts, and where are the hotspots, so to say, of people impacted by the changing climate. As you can see here, of course, there's a clear correlation with population density, but then also the hazard maps, and then there's kind of three major areas where people are particularly exposed. It's the Northern African regions, which is particularly impacted by heat. And then we've got the Sahel in West Africa, where we see a combination of heat and water stress being important. And then in East Africa, again, it's primarily heat and drought that impacts people. And as you can see here, of course, South Africa itself looks relatively safe. There's not a lot of exposed populations here. You see kind of the few cities in the Cape there that light up, but as a whole, relatively smaller numbers, relatively speaking, of exposed populations. But of course, these are only the direct impacts, the directly exposed populations. And if you look on the next page, a bit of a statement there, but of course, you have to remember that migration happens. And of course, migration, refugees are very, very hard to predict. And we didn't try to do that. The World Bank has done some modeling work. They expect over 200 million climate refugees, migrants over the next couple of decades. But the fact that South Africa does not see direct exposed populations to the same extent does, of course, not mean that there won't be impacts felt in the country, given that it's the one relatively safe haven for the entire southern half of the continent. So just to give a bit of flavor of how the changing physical climate could translate to population, humanitarian, and economic impacts. Next, we wanted to look also at what we call transition risks. So if we do take action on a global scale, not just in Africa, but the entire world achieves a 1.5 or 2 degree pathway, how does that impact businesses in Africa? And there's two main effects we wanted to highlight here. So one is how demand for commodities changes, demand volumes, given that many economies in Africa are still very dependent on revenues, revenues from commodity sales. What we mapped here on the left-hand side is the expected demand changes in a net zero transition scenario of some key commodities. And as you can see, there's basically two main impacts. One is we see that what we call energy materials, coal, for example, oil and gas, see a big drop in demand because we just need less of those fossil fuels, et cetera, in a decarbonized world. On the other hand, there's certain commodities, those that feed into, let's say, zero carbon technologies, lithium for EV batteries, for example, cobalt, et cetera, that actually see a big increase in demand. And of course, that's the transition opportunity, so to say. But there's the transition risk here, clearly, that many of the current economic engines, the commodities that drive a lot of the economic performance of some regions of the continent, we will see a significant decline in global demand. So that's the one.
Hauke. Can I just jump in? I see in the chat a few questions around sort of, hey, to what level are we certain on these predictions, and what is sort of the degree of certainty, and how do we deal with sort of these certain uncertainty in these in these outlooks? Because I recognize, and I saw a few comments in the chat. Yeah, this is a view, but this is not by no means try to predict the future. So maybe you can comment on that, Hauke.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, I didn't follow the chat.
No, I know, but I was following
the physical changes or this page?
No, not so much on this page. I saw a few comments on the chat before in some of the outlooks on 1.5 degree.
Yeah.
How certain we are that if we get to a 1.5 degree pathway, that these are the impacts on the climate.
Got it. Yeah. So look, I mean, climate science.
And probably an example there, Hauke, is slide 15. I can go back to it if you do want.
Yeah.
And thanks for the question.
That question there, yeah, like what likelihood will this happen, right? The 15.
Yeah, it's a good question. And look, and we should of course preface this with saying that we're not climate scientists, right? So I happen to be a physicist, but I did my PhD in astrophysics, and I recall doing pretty badly on my atmospheric physics exams in university. But I've worked quite closely with climate scientists over the years, so maybe I can share some perspectives. Yeah, so climate science is, of course, it's difficult. The climate is a highly complex system. It's hard to forecast. Having said that, scientists have gotten really good with climate models, and so the degree of let's say accuracy, not precision, but accuracy, has been increased significantly over the last decades. So on larger spatial scales, now it's not going down to city level or even country level, but on regional scales, climate models are actually pretty robust these days. Now, of course, a key uncertainty is the input assumptions around emissions. It's always driven by an assumption on the emissions trajectory, but that's just an input variable, right? That's the scenario you choose to examine. You choose to say, okay, I want to look at this emission trajectory for the world and ask what will that translate to in terms of physical variable changes. Yeah, so that's an input variable, the emissions trajectory. And that's why we highlighted this as RCP 8.5. RCP 8.5 is one of a couple of representative concentration pathways, is what RCP stands for, that the climate science community chooses to kind of have a standardized library suite of scenarios that they examine. So as you then go to, let's say, knock-on impacts, so river flooding, soil moisture, and things like that, it gets harder. But again, the science is pretty robust. It gets really hard when we go to small spatial scales, and when we ask what's going to happen in the Cape region in Southern Africa, and the error bars widen quite significantly. But fundamentally, in terms of the magnitude of the changes, the scientists have pretty high confidence in these results. I'm not sure if that answers the question. I'm happy to either take this offline, or if the person asking the question like to speak.
Move on, and we're going to come back again. Maybe we can have a broad set of discussions around the science and how robust it is, and so on. So let's come back to that. Maybe if you can just
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so we kind of shifted gears a bit to what we call the transition risk side of the risk equation. I had shared this page around that looked at the changes in commodity demands. The other effect that's important to bear in mind, if you look at the next page, thank you, is the fact that as the global economy strives to decarbonize, companies and countries make net zero commitments, customers, buyers of these commodities that Africa produces will increasingly look not only at price, but also at carbon content of those commodities when they make their purchasing decisions. And that's already happening. So I work with a bunch of automotive companies, for example, in Europe, who've now committed to decarbonize their full supply chains. And they're now embedding CO2 content as one of the key procurement criteria, and are working, evaluating potential suppliers and working with them to help them decrease their emissions, so they can then say that this car that you're buying, dear customer, is actually completely net zero. It's not just electric, it's also the input materials are low carbon as well. Also, this notion of carbon intensity is going to become more and more important in a net zero world. And so what we looked at here is not the classical cost supply curve of some commodities, but with the carbon intensity supply curves, and looked at where some African countries land on those compared to the global supplier base. And as you can see, it's a mixed picture. Some countries are actually quite far to the left. They're relatively more competitive on having lower carbon emissions embedded in their product. Others are more to the right, so have relatively higher carbon emissions. To just illustrate what impact that could have. Now, if you look on the next page, we did a bit of a kind of a simulation where we said, okay, assuming that carbon is priced at $100 per ton. And pricing here could take many forms. It could be a carbon price, a carbon tax in the country that where the production happens. It could be a carbon border adjustment mechanism like the EU is now proposing, or it could just be an internal shadow carbon price that the buying company, the customer, uses to select their suppliers. Yeah, but assuming that we put a price, and again, this is very scenario driven, we're not saying this is going to happen, of $100 per ton of CO2, how would the kind of the cost curve change? And you see here on the top is the gold cash cost supply curve without a carbon price, and then at the bottom it is with that $100 carbon price embedded. And as you can see, there's quite some changes. South Africa, in particular, moves more to the right. So it gets relatively more expensive. We put out those figures here on the right-hand side of the page, looking at the aggregate impact. And as you can see, South African suppliers would see an 18% cost increase under this $100 carbon tax scenario, compared to 9% for the global average and 7% for rest of Africa. And of course, this is a risk that can be managed. You can reduce carbon emissions, decarbonize operations. The point here is really this is going to become a key competitive differentiator. And you can look at the current position here to figure out what may be a good strategic response to this trend.
Hey, Hauke, maybe we can go back one page just to make sure that everyone understands sort of the concept that we're trying. So if you look at the first line, the first horizontal, that's sort of the gold, the product of gold. And what you see is on that sort of horizontal axis, how much CO2 is actually emitted for a unit or an ounce, or a relatively unit or an ounce of gold. And what you see in Ghana, for example, it's very low because of the way they produce. In South Africa, it's relatively very high. And it's important to look at this for every export product of South Africa, because at some point in time, the buyers of these products will look at this and say, how much CO2 is actually needed to produce the ounce or the ton or the kilo, in this case, of gold. And that is the point we're trying to make. And specifically in gold, you see that South Africa is all the way to the right, and therefore relatively emits a lot of CO2 for producing the ounce of gold.
Yeah, thank you. And I think to France's point, just to reiterate that we're already getting, and you'll probably have seen announcements, we're already getting the pressure as South African industry to make some commitments. We're seeing it through direct engagements with mining companies who are already doing their own, thinking about their own decarbonization pathway because of pressures from their clients or from investors in their companies. So it's not that they're waiting, they're already making these shifts. And that's a good segue actually into the next section, thanks Hauke, which is the South Africa energy perspective. What we did is, in response to a lot of these clients who are facing this risk, asking kind of what could we do on our own, what could be the impact, what are even the opportunities in a transition in South Africa. We put together our own kind of view. We know there's been a lot of work done, great work done, for example, by Eskom, by CSIR, by the National Business Initiative, for example, on pathways. What we try to do is look specifically at a few things. One is, how can we link this back to this 1.5 degree pathway and the need to achieve net zero by 2050, at least in our view. And then two is, we looked a bit closer at the hydrogen economy as well, in particular, and the role, the trade, not the trade-off, but the transition between, for example, gas and hydrogen and battery storage. When do each of those become important in supporting the transition? Obviously, there's also technical issues around how you operate the grid, but we won't get into that for now. And so we had a few questions that we tried to answer. One is just for our own perspective, what is the current view on energy production? We looked a bit around demand forecast. What you see in the RRP, for example, is an assumption of a high growth trajectory. What we also then did is said, if nothing changes in the fiscal framework and the structure of the economy, what could be another demand trajectory, and also how do we compare that to what we're seeing as a global energy forecast for South Africa. We looked at kind of some of the concerns we could have with the rollout of RP, remembering that it was pre-COVID, and also looking at the current performance of the power system. And then we focused on 3 particular scenarios. One was, where does the RP take us as it was planned? 2 is, let's assume you don't want to even look at the carbon emissions as an issue or even price it. What's based on just current technology outlooks, what is the least cost path? Yeah, just economic least cost path. And then we said, what if you then had to apply this carbon budget? And in South Africa, the energy sector is about 50% of the emissions, so let's apply a 50% carbon budget. Its contribution to the carbon budget has to be 50%, as well as achieve net zero by 2050. And we try to also engage, like I said, a lot of the end users. 3 big takeaways from that. The first, it's interesting that under all 3 scenarios, we see an energy transition to a lower carbon footprint. It's just about how fast we go there. And what's interesting is that in all 3 scenarios, you get to a fairly high renewable picture. You get to above 60% renewables in all 3 scenarios. It's just how we get there. The pace could also be impacted by, how do we think about the current performance of the plant? That's energy availability factor. Whether we'll actually, even if you want to build coal, whether anyone will finance it. And also, how do you think about adding renewables because you're concerned about how you manage the grid? We see, at least from a modeling perspective, and I think others have done the same, that a faster and stronger transition could unlock significant potential. At least from a levelized cost of energy, if you can get it financed, you see that the 2 scenarios, the least cost and even what we call the green shift, would have a lower cost trajectory. Obviously, you still have to work out what the tariff is, but at least from a levelized cost of energy, it will be lower. And when we looked at just direct and indirect jobs, not induced jobs, we create a lot more. But we know that there's a significant impact in certain regions and in certain industries that cannot be ignored. And so we've got to figure out how we do this transition, and we've called it the just transition, as have done many other countries. And just to let you know, McKinsey is doing a global review of just transitions. That report is not yet out, but hopefully will be out soon. And happy to share that as well, to say what's the global impact on this of transitions and what's the socioeconomic impacts in specific regions and on certain jobs. The first thing then we looked at is, what's the impact on demand? And, the RP has certain demands, including a trajectory to support a 4% GDP growth rate. What we did is, we looked at what do we see as current trends, what would a higher uptake of electric vehicles do to the demand, for example, as well as if there's nothing that changes in the structure of the economy. We saw, at least till 2030, take into account the COVID recovery, about a 0.2% per annum increase in demand, and then going up to 0.8% per annum. Now, what that tells you is, hopefully that's a lower end of the demand, because you want to see a high uptake of electricity and maybe a different uptake or lower uptake in other energy sources, as long as this is cleaner. But you then need to be careful about over-investing and how do you remain flexible to higher growth. And so that's why we did this. What we did, and this is a busy slide, so let me take you through it slowly. So what you see on the left-hand side are the 3 scenarios. The baseline scenario, I think you can see my mouse. The second is what we call the least cost, where we look at the latest views on technology and assume the current carbon pricing in South Africa. And then the last, which assumed a carbon budget of 2 gigatons that we had to take out by 2050, and a net zero. We then looked at the 2030 picture, kind of what's the 2030 and the 2050 picture for each scenario. We've done it per year and every decade. And then we said, what would in the capacity that we worked out, what would be the kind of fossil, coal and gas mix, the solar and wind mix, the storage and hydrogen, and storage could be a multiple, so storage including pump storage, and then you have other, which could be hydro, for example. And what does that mix look like? We looked at the capex required to build this out by 2020 terms, and its cumulative capex. And then what would be the levelized cost of energy again in 2020 terms? And now you've got to assume you get the right level of financing. We made some assumptions around that. Obviously, the tariff is then you've got to add the transmission distribution costs as well as other costs, maybe to fund certain requirements. We did, and I'll come back, we did assume that you have to fund decommissioning of coal plants in the other two scenarios. We then looked at what with the annual emissions in 2030 and then 2050. And in the end, the net jobs created or lost, and you'll see that number. So for example, you see a 20 means 20,000 jobs created, net creation with all these scenarios. Now, this, you'll see this differs from some of the other numbers that have come out, which are higher because they've looked deeper in the value chain. We didn't go as far. And what's interesting is that you'll see that by 2050, in all three scenarios, 60% or above of the mix will be renewables, and 28% or above is in the storage or hydrogen space, which is interesting. You still have some fossil remnants because you still have some gas in the transition and so on. In the green shift, you decommission plant quicker. You see a 19% part of the mix, and you have to take that into account in terms of how do you finance the transition. You'll see that the levelized cost is interesting, that by 2050, you'll see that whether it's least cost or green shift, actually you get close to each other. So what's interesting is actually also the least cost pathway could equate to the green shift pathway. The challenge is the initial financing by 2030. You'll see that the green shift will require an acceleration of new investments as well as take into account the decommissioning of plants. So it's about 1.1 trillion compared to a least cost of 500 billion. But offers also additional jobs. What we then did is we also, and this, sorry, the next page is a bit of a deep dive of where the jobs creation and lost are. Clearly, it will be in the energy and construction sector where you see the net jobs by 2050 created. And then you see jobs lost in the existing coal value chain and then created in the new value chains. And it's just about how severe that transition will be between the base case and the green shift. There will be this impact, it's just how quickly it happens. What we then looked at is some sensitivities. There's this big debate about how big a role gas will play and how does it vary with pricing. We looked at different price assumptions. Now, what's more important than what's the global gas price is what can you get in South Africa, either through a floating terminal or possibly a pipeline from Mozambique, which could still take 10 years to get completed. And you'll see that there's a view that the price range is between $8 and nearly $10 MMBTU, as they say. There's a view that it could be as much as 10 to 14 in South Africa. And it's very unlikely we'll get a pipeline to get the lower price in the next 10 years. So our range of estimates is between 10 and 17 gigawatts, assuming you can get hydrogen scaled up. If you don't do hydrogen, this number will go up because gas will play an important role in the transition, even though there's volatility in the pricing, and it might not be available in South Africa, but you'd have to pipe it in. So that's the first thing. So there's a 10 to 17 gigawatt and the assumption that you'll do hydrogen as well, and battery storage. The second thing is we looked at, if we struggle to build grid, but also what's the pent-up demand in commercial and industrial demand as well as in mining. We think you could get up to a 20 gigawatt kind of beyond the meter type or solar distributed generation by 2050. But, there's a range of that. It's about 10% of the demand at that point in time. And if you said that's maybe not as optimal a build, the actual overall increase in levelized cost is 3 to 4%. But it'll be, very particular in different areas. We then looked at different carbon tax scenarios, and as Hauke said, we can't assume that we'll be exempt. Even if we don't apply carbon pricing in South Africa, there will be indirect carbon pricing, either as the European Union is thinking about, but also through consumers pricing it or suppliers pricing it into their procurement choices. And we said that, as we did the model, we said that there's a tipping point above $40 a ton, where actually the least cost path becomes the green shift, as we call it, where we're trying to meet this 1.5 degree pathway for South Africa. We then spent some time on hydrogen in particular, and we felt that if the current trajectory goes on electrolyzer costs, solar PV costs in particular, we work out how to both store and transport hydrogen and burn it, because you do need some way of grid stabilization. We're getting to between 19 and 26 gigawatts of capacity, hydrogen capacity, in the power sector to support this transition. And the shift by 2040 is pretty significant. Where it happens between 2030 and 2040 is based on the ambition that we have as South Africa, and that's just in the power sector. We took this further and tried to then understand the value pools for hydrogen in a kind of what we call a slow transition and accelerated transition, and in what kind of broad segments. And you'll see here that, in a slow transition, the value pool is in terms of revenue, is between 0.3 and then $1.2 billion by 2050. But in accelerated transition, we believe it's up to 6 billion rand. With the biggest contribution in the power sector, but also road transport and aviation being a big component of this value pool, and it could shift. There are possibly other pools, including export pools, and we have done some modeling around that too. So thank you. That's the end of our presentation, and maybe now
I saw one question you may want to still answer.
Yeah.
Around sort of when you showed the scenarios, the least cost, the green shift, and sort of the base transition, there was a question around sort of RRP and what we did sort of with the base assumptions and why we not took RRP for all the scenarios. Yeah.
So the RRP, I think there's a lot of literature out there on the RRP itself, but also others who published work on scenarios around the RP. What we are more interested in at the moment is to say, based on the latest cost trends on technologies, as well as trying to align to what we've done globally on the 1.5 degree pathway, what would that look for South Africa, and how urgent are the decision making, or how urgent is decision making to get onto this pathway? And that's why we did those two particular scenarios. To contribute to the debate and to provide a bit more facts, or at least more data rather than facts, into the discussion. So that's why we did these two in particular, rather than trying to do more scenarios around the RP. So for example, on the least cost, what we looked at is the updated learning curves on solar, nuclear, renewables, concentrated solar, storage and hydrogen, and even some carbon capture and storage issues. And like I said, the green shift, we try to align to our global work around what is the budget we need to meet. What you also see is the time to action if you want to move to green shift is now. In the next 10 years, you've already started, otherwise you can't meet the budget, while you have a bit more time in the other two scenarios. I don't know if that answers the question, and happy to take more. Yeah. There was a question about whether we get the slides. Yes. We will figure out how to do that. And already this is recorded, I believe, Wendy, so I'm sure SANEA will be able to share. Wendy and or Franche, if you can also help me to see the other questions.
I can help you here, or Wendy, I see one. I don't think we can comment on this. Does McKinsey believe Sasol is a sustainable business when CO2 taxes become a reality? Our concern is that CO2 taxes would eliminate Sasol's entire profit.
Sure.
I'm not sure how we can, maybe you can.
Yeah, I'll word it in a different way. So if I look at the South African industry, obviously the power sector is one of the biggest contributors to the carbon emissions, about 50%. There are other sectors that are significant as well. Obviously the oil and gas, chemicals, plus a few others. I think every one of those sectors is taking this seriously and is trying to figure out what its decarbonization pathway is. They're not waiting. and that is as a result of, as I said, investor and customer pressure, their own customers. And I think they will each produce their views pretty, I'm sure, over time. I think I can confidently say each one of those are taking this pretty seriously and not ignoring the challenge in front of them.
Thank you. And I have one more question, and then I think we had most of them. On page 26, there's a question around storage and hydrogen, if there are sources. So basically, what the comment here is, they are generated by solar and wind. So because storage and H2 are not sort of sources by itself, they're then generated by solar and wind. So the magnitude of solar and wind is even sort of higher, because they also are needed to generate that the hydrogen, or to create the hydrogen.
To create the hydrogen, yeah. We've taken that into account, right? And what you're trying to do with hydrogen storage is use the excess capacity from the, when you generate, especially solar, not so much as wind, but solar, store it and then use it at the right times to support the peak requirements. You'll still need some gas, as you've seen even in the least cost, in the green shift, but by and large, you're starting to shift to hydrogen and some storage, battery storage.
So I think, Ken, and this is Wendy, I think there's also a sort of a debate going on about the importance of assumptions in all this kind of modeling work, and how they really impact, the final outcomes.
Yeah.
So perhaps you guys just want to comment a little bit about that. And the uncertainty, obviously, that still exists in a lot of this debate, because we can't predict everything down to the last decimal point.
Correct. So let me start at least with the science, and I love how could you just talk broadly about the science, because there's always this debate whether it's guesses or, and the way we think about science is there's now a track record of what the science has said and what we've seen. That's the first thing. The second is also kind of the amount of academic output that's been done and how that's been peer reviewed. And then thirdly is kind of the robustness of the future forecasting, the scenarios that we're testing. Maybe Bram and Franci can also talk to that. Because what we've done is not just take one, we've taken a range of scenarios and assumptions and said, what do we think is a pathway? Maybe Hauke, do you want to just comment on the science, and please, anyone else can add. And then we'll go from there. Yeah. But maybe just let me be clear from Mackenzie's point of view. We are pretty convinced that the science is clear on this issue, and that this is the most significant concern facing humanity. And if we don't deal with it urgently, we will be in trouble. And we are already seeing the signs of that. So let me just be clear about that, but we'll talk about the science. Go ahead, Hauke.
Yeah, look, I mean, as I said before, right, we're not scientists. Most of us, at least not climate scientists. Yeah, but at least most of us have learned to trust the science process and the academic process, right? I mean, I'm trusting it when I go in and have an operation done by me, by modern medicine, etc., etc. But for some reason, climate science evokes emotional responses in some people. So if you look at the facts, I mean, the track record is very well established. I mean, there have now been climate science predictions for several decades. And they've all checked out. So even the relatively rudimentary early models from decades ago have made robust, verifiable predictions. I think the body of evidence that climate science works is absolutely overwhelming. It's pretty simple at that level. It gets less simple and nuanced when we look at kind of the boundaries of forecasting, as I tried to explain, particularly when it comes to very highly spatially resolved forecasts. There are some things that are currently not factored into climate models, biotic feedbacks that become important at timescales of several decades into the future, which are currently being built into these models, as I understand. But with sufficient duty of care, climate science is a very, very reliable and robust tool to inform decision making.
If I can,
another question. Sorry, Bram, do you want to continue?
Yeah, let me just briefly comment and maybe also help structure a little bit the different steps that we see in the debate. Because I think so the first thing that we look at is how does our economic activity translate into emissions in a way. Then step 2 is how do emissions lead to global warming? And the third step is how does global warming then have impacts? And I think we've touched upon all those 3 topics in a way, but to give you a little bit of the underlying depth. So the first step, understanding how economic activity leads to emissions and how we can reduce those emissions and control those. This is where literally hundreds of our colleagues at McKinsey are working on every day, with clients also all over the world to understand exactly sector by sector what are current emission profiles, what can we expect going forward, but also what are some of the decarbonization options that we see. And I think there the conclusion from the discussion today was getting to a strong decarbonization path is tremendously challenging. It will come with major challenges and barriers to overcome. But we see routes to strong decarbonization, and we see many of our clients actually getting active in the debate and strongly shifting their strategies. I think that the discussion also in the climate science debates is focusing on how do emissions lead to warming and what are the impacts of that level of warming. And there, to echo Hauke a little bit, this is a debate that has been going on for a very long time. There is a lot of uncertainty still to be addressed, but the fact that there is uncertainty about the exact outcomes in our minds should not be a reason to sit back and wait for the whole debate to be resolved. And that's in a way also why we've taken an active role trying to translate the academic debates into implications, into the slide packs that we typically use for communication, and that's what we've wanted to share also today.
Thanks. And Canon, there is another question on carbon capture and storage, about it being a viable option for South Africa, given our geology.
Yeah. So on carbon capture and storage, I think it's still a challenge to make it work with the current economics, both because of technology and then geology. What we are seeing, though, is also different types of technologies starting to emerge around direct air capture and a few others that over time could help us not directly capture carbon from emissions, but indirectly and then use that in different ways. But right now, yes, we're not, at least when we looked at it recently, using carbon capture sort of directly linked to our emissions, sources of emissions, is still going to be difficult in South Africa to make it work.
I don't see any other questions. Does anybody have any other comments or anything that they want to make?
Well, I think there's a question here on what's McKinsey's view on net zero, is that right? So I'm trying to read the question. So the only way we can get to is if there's no fossil fuels.
Yes, sorry, that's just kind of...
Yeah. Okay. So I think on this pathway to net zero, we're not saying there will be no emissions at all from even oil and gas players or others at the moment, at least. And Bram, I think, showed that. It's just that we have to have some way of also, in a way, taking out carbon through other things, through forestation, through direct air capture, and a few other technologies. That's the first thing. I think the second thing, there's actually quite a discussion, and Hauke alluded to this, and maybe Bram as well. We've helped several countries think of other decarbonization pathways. And I think I can talk broadly about one country in Africa, which is a challenge, is Nigeria, which, as you know, has a significant oil and gas sector, critical, and Angola could be another, but Nigeria is critical to its economy. A sharp transition would impact its people and so on. So how do you think about just transition there? If you think about the coal transition in South Africa, that's significant, but Nigeria faces an even bigger challenge. And some of the work around the Energy Transition Council leading up to COP26 and even probably COP27 is about how do these countries, still use these endowments, and then how do others make it up? Because you can't also just go to zero in those countries. So, for example, Nigeria has prepared that in line for COP26. I don't think we can share it yet, but it is, as you know, the Energy Transition Council has helped prepare that for Nigeria, so they can have a discussion at COP26. And it includes kind of what is the financial support needed, what do you allow it as a budget compared to others, right? Because again, you can't expect it to, in a way, rapidly deindustrialize when it needs to support other sectors. So that's, I think you'll have those debates, and so we're not sure how this will pan out, but clearly there will still be emissions from some of these sectors. And then it's about how do you minimize it, but then how do you then have these alternatives, negative emissions as well. Do you guys want to add anything, Hauke or Theo, off mute?
Good summary. Thanks, Glenn. I think since we had the debate about uncertainties, et cetera, here, I mean, the bigger uncertainties really are around technology developments, right, and the toolbox to achieve net zero. Now we're talking about a 30-year program here. And in the course of those 30 years, new technologies will come to the fore. Some technologies that we expect to see significant emissions cost reductions may not see those cost reductions happen. So at the moment, it looks very challenging. And as the person said in the chat, I think the oil and gas exploration and the production plans do not really stack up with a net zero commitment. So something needs to change there. But we believe, as Bram said, it's challenging but fundamentally feasible.
Yeah. So two questions that came up on technologies. I think let's start with the first one, which is around battery storage and our view. Bram, would you like to do that? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about direct air capture as well.
So if we look at battery costs, so over the past roughly 10 years, we've seen a very strong decline in cost there, over 80%. And what that has meant is that we're now at a point in time where the per kilometer cost of an electric vehicle starts to be actually competitive with conventional internal combustion engines. Now we've got a specialized group within McKinsey that's called the McKinsey Center for Future Mobility that spends a lot of their time looking exactly at batteries, battery costs, understanding battery composition and alternative configurations. What we project is actually that these costs are going to continue to decline over the next 10, 15 years. And what it will mean is, I think, two important tipping points will be triggered. The first one is in road transport particularly, or transport more broadly, where 5 years from now, the economics of electric vehicles just make sense and actually are competing out conventional cars. That's even true in many of the truck segments. The second tipping point that we see is then that in power, the usage of batteries, either large industrial scale batteries, but also more small scale batteries that we can have as consumers that can then be paired and combined, that actually starts to be economic in combination with some of the renewable sources. So what we anticipate is that's already in the next 5 years in road transport, we'll see a strong uptake of electric vehicles, also in many different parts of the world. In the power sector, we see that shift really happening around 2030. Happy to follow up in greater detail if that's of interest.
Yeah. And maybe just on that, and then let's talk about direct air capture. I think in addition to that, while you see electric vehicles, a lot of emissions in some of the more emerging markets are also around electric two-wheelers and electric three-wheelers. So like Indonesia, India, East Africa, West Africa, Philippines, and so on. And we already seen through some of our analysis, for example, in East Africa and even West Africa, the total cost of ownership for electric two-wheeler is now already at par with the ICE two-wheeler already now. And what the challenge is how do you make it more convenient for those who are driving two-wheelers? For example, battery swaps, because many of them are kind of being used as taxis, battery swap facilities, charging, and so on. But it's interesting, we've just done the analysis on two-wheelers. So you're already seeing a business case without anything else, no taxes, nothing, where the business case is already shifting in that regard because of the pricing of batteries. And that's not utility scale, obviously, but we also looked at that for power. On the power side, we also looked at, the cost curve coming down significantly and already making it competitive. And you see that with also this latest round of pricing in this the rapid IPP program, right? The intermediate one, while you're waiting for the next round of renewables. There are a lot of battery storage, utility scale battery storage projects that you can start seeing where the pricing is. The question around direct air capture, do we believe it's feasible? You still need carbon capture. I think maybe Ram can also add to this. What we're seeing is it's part of a process to produce other products. So you might use it with hydrogen, for example. So direct air capture, hydrogen to make end-use product like ammonia or something else, like power to fuel option as a start. And then as technology costs come down, then you see it in other applications. So we've seen some trajectories there, and you've seen some pilots because of that. So once you start seeing proper pilots, as we're seeing now, already we have some view of where how the cost could come down and make it feasible in other applications. So we're pretty confident that we're seeing that trajectory starting to happen. But obviously we've got to, we have to still wait a while to make sure it materializes properly. Bram, do you want to add to that?
No, I would just reiterate that we are going to need a broad suite of technological solutions in general for the decarbonization challenge. I think direct air capture is an example of a relatively immature technology still that needs a lot of additional R&D, a lot of pilot projects to start scaling then. And by definition, what it then also means is that, of course, there's uncertainty around the cost path that Kenan alluded to, and also the speed of development that we're going to see, which oftentimes, of course, is also a function of how much funds are being allocated, how much activity do we see in the short run. But so indeed, I think the verdict is still out there, but we do see that this is a topic that is receiving attention alongside many others.
Maybe just to make sure that we get the jargon right here, right? So CCS, carbon capture and storage, is typically applied when you filter CO2 out of concentrated sources, like from a coal power plant, whereas direct air capture, DAC, is just sucking carbon out of the ambient air. Of course, the latter is much, much harder, because we're talking about something that's at 450 parts per million, so tiny concentrations, having a highly concentrated stream of de facto CO2. So CCS, much easier, still costly, but much easier. Direct air capture, you just need a lot more energy. So it tends to be kind of the measure of last resort, because it's like literally the hardest thing you can do to reduce emissions or to manage CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. It's viable, but you just need super cheap energy to manage the cost. I think people may have seen the announcements, I think last week in Iceland, which of course has cheap power because of all the geothermal energy. There was a kind of a commercial scale direct air capture plant launch. So the technology is being invested in. We're seeing the first pilots starting up, but it's literally the last thing you want to do once you've exhausted all other options.
Yeah, thank you. And I see a lot of questions around, our modeling of the socioeconomic impacts and so on, and Hauck has responded with some sources. But as I said, we continue to update our analysis on that, at least at the global perspective. So as we release that, we will obviously share it, and happy to share it through SANEA as well. Wendy, I'm not sure if I've missed any questions or we've missed any questions in the chat.
I don't believe so. I think you have covered all of them. Unless there are any other final questions from anybody. If not, I'd like to really thank the McKinsey team for this very thought-provoking presentation, and I think really timely for South Africa. We know that we are negatively impacted, as you have so clearly shown, both physically and economically, by climate change. And so it's something that really has to be on the top of our agenda to make sure that we are able to adapt. And we need to do it quickly as well. So I really thank you, and thank you so much for making your slides available. And we will definitely take you up on your kind offer to come back when you have your new work that's been completed. I think it's been a really great session with a lot of debate, and which is what we want. We want people to be able to really engage in these topics and question and to be able to deepen our understanding. So thank you all so very much. We really appreciate it. And I think we're going to just close off, Angela, with sorry, I just see that there's 2 questions on the, no, it's fine. We're going to close off with just some announcements about some very exciting things that SANEA has planned coming up in the near future.
Thank you, everybody. Just showing on your screen at the moment, we've got a couple of slides showing the activities coming up. The most exciting being our World Energy Day conference with our SANEA Energy Awards. We're planning it for the 21st and 22nd of October. So you would have seen some announcements go out recently. Later today, we will be announcing our first 2 keynote speakers, and then we will be launching the program details over the next couple of weeks. But very exciting event for SANEA. And following on from that is also our annual Energy Awards. We will be announcing the Energy Award winners at the event. Just to let you know, nominations are currently open. They will be open until the 1st of October. There are a variety of awards categories looking at trailblazers, looking at energy shapeshifters, looking at specific projects, journalism recognition, education recognition. So we will send out a communication after this in terms of the slides and the recording, but also some links to some further information. So we really hope that you will look out for these announcements and join us at these very special events. Thank you, Wendy.
Thanks so much, Angela, for that. As she said, we're very excited about our upcoming events, and we're going to be launching the risk report as well. So it's going to be really packed with information, and we hope a lot more dialogue and discussion. So thank you all very much for attending today, and please stay safe. And we look forward to seeing you at our next SANEA event. Bye, everyone.